Hello to the more than 300 people joining us tonight for this experience live. And hello to those who are joining us at a future moment in time and from many other parts of the world. We're going to focus as much as we can on the local tonight, on this country known relatively recently as Australia. And no matter whose country you are on, we are sharing and listening and acknowledging that we are gathering on what was and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the elders past, present and future on the lands on which you are all joining from, and I am sharing from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I especially acknowledge all First Nations people present. It is my honour to pass over to Gadigal, Yuin, Bidjigal elder Aunty Rhonda Dixon-grovenor to begin this important session of sharing future visions on the lands of her people.
Warami, Gadigal Nura, Walamabemi, Inyana, Bayalawa, Nay Nailang, Budjuri, Darabara, Yanu. Welcome to Gadigal land. My name's Aunty Rhonda Dixon-grovenor, and I'm a Gadigal, Bidjigal, Dharug, Yuin elder and traditional descendant from the Sydney and South Coast areas of New South Wales. I'd like to also acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic violence and sexual violence or sexual abuse. This is a very passionate topic for me, as I've personally experienced both domestic and sexual violence throughout my life, from my childhood and into adulthood. As an adult, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And in my 50s, I started on my healing journey and studied counselling at the College of Holistic Counselling at Artarmon. And then I went on to Southern Cross University and I studied my Masters in Aboriginal Studies, Intergenerational Trauma and Recovery and Wellbeing under Indigenous Professor Judy Atkinson. So I've been counselling and doing workshops and supporting the community for many years, over 20 years. And I've gone into the cells with Aboriginal people, Aboriginal women, written support letters and attended court. I've been a foster carer for an Aboriginal girl who is now a teenager, who I now co-care for. And her story of sexual abuse and domestic violence, which was inflicted upon her and her sister, was recently shown in a documentary with NITV. It's the link. What I want to talk about is the link between sexual abuse and domestic violence as a child, and then going into that as an adult and what it does. The trauma of that has caused a lot of trauma, addictions, mental health problems with Aboriginal people, and very high incarceration rate. And also there's been a lot of Aboriginal children taken and still being taken, like a very high percentage, away from their families. And so I'd like to see, a lot more programs that would be developed in conjunction, in partnership with other groups, and especially for Aboriginal families, and address the issues from intergenerational trauma. And I have experienced domestic violence and sexual abuse and sexual violence in my childhood, but I'm one of the few lucky ones who was able to go in search of how and what I needed to do to learn to heal myself. And then, so learning those skills has enabled me to be able to go out into the community and, you know, be there for our people, and especially women. So I'm a living proof and a success story of how living with trauma, how it can be healed. And so I'm in a program with another colleague. She's asked me to work on a program called Radical Kindness. And I think that if people who've been traumatised by sexual abuse and domestic violence, whether it's a man or a woman or children or whoever, that they need to be taught new skills and be treated with compassion rather than be treated as if they're bad people, you know. So I'd like to see, like, people, organisations partner with those who are closest to the problem, because usually they're the closest to the solution. And thank you for giving me the time to speak. Yuin.
Thank you, Aunty Rhonda, as always. Thank you for your generous and fierce social justice leadership and for sharing with us today. The goal of this event is really to connect passionate advocates for change in the family, domestic and sexual violence field, and to emerge from this experience with newly sharpened advocacy tools. It's a trigger warning that some of the topics that we're raising may trigger trauma, and you are very welcome to step away from the session at any time to care for yourself. A brief warning now to avoid a kind of time travel whiplash, that the keynote speakers will also be speaking from a future perspective from 2031. All of them have been asked to share their vision of a better 2031 and to share what obstacles they think we could have overcome with bolder leadership, sharper advocacy, and more resources going where they're needed. So I invite you all to close your eyes for a moment while I try my best to set the futuring tone and to situate us in 2031. It's so great that we could all find the time to come together again, 10 years after the Women's Marches and Women's Safety Summit of 2021. My name is Dr. Clare Cooper. I met some of you through some community organising and creative advocacy workshops back in mid-2020. I'm a mother, a musician, a cis white woman. I'm celebrating 30 years as a teacher and workshop facilitator this year, and I'm still lecturing and researching in design futuring in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. It's been 10 years since the international medical humanitarian organisation Médecins Sans Frontières decided to support the Illawarra Women's Health Centre during COVID-19, as demand for FDSV services had more than doubled in what was rightfully called the shadow pandemic. As projected by scientists back in the 2020s, we are witnessing and feeling the effects of greater climate-related disasters, both here in Australia and globally. Australians in their 30s have not only grown up with these events dominating the news, but have engaged in creative resilience training relating to environmental disasters, emerging health issues, displaced populations, and resource politics in their primary and high school curricula. I was then and am still a passionate practitioner of futuring. We all engage in futuring on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. Whether we realise it or not, we make our decisions based on stories of futures, to avoid boredom, disappointment, all the way to loneliness, violence, and shame. We future to seek stimulation, pleasure, companionship, safety, love, and connection. Futuring encourages us to come together to share these future visions, to energise one another. Respecting our past and future ancestors, we try our best to make informed and responsible decisions, but this isn't always available to us. So we reach out to those sometimes with more experience or with more resources, or those who have the time and energy to reflect, to dream, to imagine and create. And that's what we're trying to do tonight. So how did we get to a scenario where the rates of family, domestic and sexual violence have reduced by a drastic 50% in Australia? What were the tipping points? Has the profound change been due to glacial, incremental, constant pressure from advocates and frontline workers? Or has there been a series of events that have shocked the nation into a deep culture change? Our incredible speakers today will help to remind us how far we've come since 2021. They will help us to trace how things have shifted over the last 10 years. You will all recognise these four amazing speakers due to their vital advocacy work in the field. Professor Ash Johnstone, Dr. Karen Williams, Lula Dembele, Minister for Gender Equity currently, and Sally Stevenson. I'm going to pass over to Ash Johnstone first.
Okay, so good evening. Before I begin, I would like to thank Aunty Rhonda for her beautiful welcome to country, and I'd like to offer my own respects and acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the land that I am joining you from, the sovereign Dharawal peoples. I would ask that all of you take a moment to recognise the people whose lands you are joining us from now. We are all joining each other here tonight from many different areas, but no matter where in Australia you are right now, you are on Indigenous land, which has never and will never be ceded. If you're following along on Twitter, here's the hashtag you can use, and also my handle as well. My name is Ash Johnstone, a First Nations Dunghutti woman. 10 years ago, I was an academic with a fresh PhD and a frontline Indigenous domestic violence worker based at Women Illawarra. Today, I am still working as an academic, but now I am a professor in my university's Indigenous Research Department. As you all know, 10 years ago, the COVID pandemic led to a widespread disillusionment with how our political parties operate and with how we respond to emergencies as a society. Then, in 2022, in response to ongoing protests and a demand from the Australian people for real leadership and change, Australia became a world leader in Indigenous politics when it became mandatory for all Australian state premiers to operate as co-premiers, with one of the pair required to be a First Nations person. While difficult to implement in the beginning, this quickly led to a radical investment in funding First Nations people to become involved in politics at all levels, resulting in a significantly higher number of First Nations politicians at all levels of government, from town councils to the Senate. We now see that by having First Nations voices heard and represented in this way, there has been a dramatic shift in how our society responds to many different types of important issues, with significant improvement in many key areas. One of the most notable of these new policies and legislations is, of course, the Land Back movement, which has seen control of traditional homelands returned to First Nations people. We have also seen shifts in our global policies, our economy, and our education systems. However, while there are many, many policy changes we could discuss, I am here today to reflect specifically on the changes in how domestic, family, and sexual violence is now addressed in 2031. First and foremost, we now see community-led First Nations healing knowledge used to address domestic, family, and sexual violence. There are easily accessible Indigenous healing programs and community-controlled responses to domestic violence. By focusing on DV as a community health issue and seeking to address it in this way initially, we see less involvement overall of the criminal justice system. This has multiple benefits, including keeping people out of prison and reducing the trauma associated with going through this system. Any person experiencing domestic, family, or sexual violence is eligible to access emergency accommodation the same day they report needing help. This has dramatically reduced the amount of incidents being reported. These people are then able to be assessed for mid-term and long-term housing support, and within days are able to access suitable accommodation. We can see that the availability of housing has been one of the key areas of improvement for people experiencing domestic, family, and sexual violence. With the new housing legislation led by New South Wales' first Indigenous co-premier that demands that 1 in every 5 new building projects must also provide social housing, we can see a direct correlation between the availability of safe housing and the reduction in the number of people experiencing domestic, family, and sexual violence. While considered ambitious at the time of its proposal, the government eventually responded to the positive feedback from communities who advised that they consider social housing as important and something they want to see more of in their areas. As such, it was implemented with immediate success for reducing homelessness. All perpetrators of domestic, family and sexual violence are able to enrol in community-run programs which seek to educate them on the impact of DV on their loved ones, as well as being provided with ongoing counselling. They are also supported to find appropriate housing and linked with employment and training programs, and where suitable, drug and alcohol programs. The rollout of targeted social marketing, such as advertisements during prime time on TV and radio, saw an increase in the number of self-referrals by people who commit domestic violence and an increase in enrolment in these programs. Training of magistrates in domestic, family and sexual violence and new initiatives to direct perpetrators into these programs has also been received positively. We have seen an overhaul of our healthcare and Medicare system, notably a reduction in cost for health services and mandatory training in racism and discrimination for all healthcare professionals that must be renewed every 2 years. This has reduced reports of racism experienced when accessing health services. People are able to report racism within healthcare to an independent investigations body who take this very seriously. Unfortunately, as we all know, communities that experience a natural disaster soon see an increase in rates of domestic, family and sexual violence. However, it is hoped that with our new policies to reduce climate pollution and invest in sustainable energy, we will see not only that this will improve our economy, it will also reduce health issues, save lives and reduce domestic, family and sexual violence. Reflective of the fact that we are now experiencing the harmful effects of climate change on a day-to-day level, we also have policies to assist people living in climate-affected areas as a key priority. The highly successful land back movement has seen an increase in sustainable practices on lands that have been returned to First Nations people. We are seeing an investment into renewable energy, as well as fast and effective support for communities suffering from climate disasters. Unlike the terrible 2019 bushfire disaster, which saw community members still living in sheds 12 months later, we now have effective community responses which quickly and efficiently address the needs of those people impacted by climate disasters, such as fire and flood events. This has significantly reduced the amount of DV being reported after disasters. So to summarise my philosophy in regards to the last 10 years, I think that when we reflect on where we have been and what we have achieved, we see that as a society, we actually have the power to build for ourselves communities that work for us, that are safe and sustainable, that provide equal opportunities, and that support all of our people to achieve healthy and happy lives. I'm grateful to say that in 2031, I now live in a place that actively strives to never see a single person with no safe place to sleep, in a place that embraces First Nations knowledge, in a place that listens to advocates and experts. These kinds of changes did not happen overnight. They happened after years of tireless campaigning and advocacy from all of you. And I think that this is one of the most powerful messages that I would leave with you tonight, the power of the individual. Every single person here tonight has the power to be a true ally, not only in their own attitudes, but in their practices within the community services space. If your organisation does not engage with Indigenous people, it is your responsibility to question why not. If your project does not have Indigenous people informing and guiding you, it is your personal duty to ask why not. If your service does not have Indigenous workers, not just on the ground, but also in the boardroom and management teams, it is your responsibility to demand why not. Collaboration, community-led, sovereignty and self-determination are not just buzzwords used during NAIDOC and Reconciliation Week and then put away again. They are the cornerstones of achieving true equality. So if not you, then who? Thank you. Sorry, I forgot I have to introduce the next person. So up next after me, I have Dr. Karen Williams.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry for that. Thank you, Professor Johnson, and thank you, Aunty Rhonda, for your beautiful welcome. My name is Karen Williams, and I too speak from Dharug land and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm here to talk about family violence, which, as you know, is a major health issue. It's interesting to think that back in 2021, it was considered a woman's issue or a feminist issue, a consideration of the socially aware, some might say the political left. Back then, even though family violence was the biggest cause of mortality and morbidity in women, domestic violence was barely touched on in my medical training. We may have had the occasional lecture on some of the consequences of it, but in no way were we taught the enormous implications of violence on our mental and physical health, nor were we really aware of the far-reaching social implications that came from that blindness. A few things have shifted over this time, since 2021. In 2021, we were a society that was really so privileged in many ways that there were many people who didn't care about who ran the country. Some of us didn't have to care. Some of us voted for whoever our friends and families voted for. But what was born out of the worldwide pandemic of COVID-19 and the ongoing environmental changes and catastrophes that have come as a consequence of global warming was that suddenly people did have to care. There were more people displaced. There were more people experiencing a loss of the privileges that they had previously enjoyed. Sadly, COVID also resulted in the demise of the Murdoch family, and an awareness of truth caused a groundswell of change. Grassroots organisations started to develop, consisting of those who had suffered from the trauma of homelessness, loss of lives, and loss of livelihoods. Those in positions of power had to actually demonstrate that they were going to do things. They finally had to show that they would respond to the needs of all of its people, and this time that would include women. What we saw was a huge shift away from the hyper-capitalist consumer culture to one which valued and actively sought a world that was far more equitable and far more reflective on how we responded to that lack of equity. There were other things that happened too, and as these changes were occurring, what we saw was a change in our culture of victim blaming around family violence. This was a direct result around the fact that there was an ignorance around coercive control. People didn't understand that women remained in dangerous relationships because there was very little safe alternative, and this led them to remain in a fawning type relationship with the aggressor. For those on the outside, this looked like she didn't want to help herself. This looked like she was part of the problem because she didn't want to try to leave. Not only was coercive control being perpetrated on her by her abuser, but the system also fostered that abuse by telling her that she was part of the problem because she didn't pursue charges or because she did not save herself and her children from her abuser. There was only a few outcomes for women who were being abused. One would be that no one would ever find out about the abuse and she would live with the ongoing torture of family violence for decades, and her children too would be exposed to that violence. The other outcome would be that someone might find out about that abuse, for example, child protection. But what could happen would be that their response would be punitive and the child would be removed from the mother. Or she might choose to leave, but then she had to go through the hurdle of the family law court, where the moment she stepped in, she would be accused of lying, of being an alienator. And it was really, really common for abused women to have her children removed and given to the perpetrator himself. In any event, good outcomes were really rare, but this is different now because our approach to management is so much better. We didn't really have much in the way of primary prevention back in 2021. Primary prevention being dealing with the domestic violence before it were to happen. So now in 2031, we have a range of measures that we didn't see before, a huge emphasis on social welfare, free childcare for all women, no matter her household income. All children are taught how to identify coercion. They're taught about healthy, safe sex practices, how to identify abuse, how to recognise grooming. And this starts in primary school and continues all through the child's education. Financial management is also a compulsory subject. Teachers are taught to identify signs of trauma without immediately assuming that the child has ADHD or a conduct disorder. Women have their own online health record for which they have control over. And there is early identification and options for at-risk families. We had a huge emphasis in 2021 on secondary prevention, so that is dealing with a crisis. In 2021, that focus looked like police recording assaults every 20 to 30 minutes, but that was really all that they were doing. The outcome of recording lots of assaults is a big database of recorded assaults, but very little in the way of convictions and very little reduction in safety overall. The cost was enormous and huge amounts of money were invested with no real outcome. In fact, police involvement would be very often a traumatic encounter in and of itself. So now police must demonstrate genuine attempts to assess the safety of women seeking help, as well as to help her secure the evidence that she might need, including video recordings, taping phone calls, and there are actual consequences for perpetrators beyond AVOs. Now that we have family and sexual violence experts embedded in the police station, along with mandatory trauma-informed training, things have improved, and it will continue to improve as accountability measures are now heavily employed within the service. Obviously, for secondary prevention to be effective and not just further traumatising, it wasn't just the police that needed further training. Our entire workforce that responds to family violence needed to understand the traumatic impacts of family violence. So now that includes all healthcare workers, emergency workers, teachers and lawyers. Everybody in the community needs to understand the impact of family violence so that at the very least, our community doesn't do more damage. And then there's tertiary prevention, to dealing with the long-term impacts of family and sexual violence. And that brings me to where I originally started my journey as a psychiatrist. Back then, women and children who were tortured by their partner were not considered to be as tortured as, say, a police officer or defence personnel. So what I was seeing as a general psychiatrist was women who had been strangled, who had head injuries, who'd been made to eat dog food, who were raped, who had been held hostage, who were stalked and monitored, made to kneel for hours on gravel, all of these sort of things, and none of them in 2021 were getting adequate care for PTSD. So at one stage, and I will talk about a patient that I saw at that time, I was able to look after a police officer and treat his PTSD because he had turned up to a domestic violence homicide, but I was unable to treat her daughter who witnessed the murder. That is unheard of today in 2031. Unless you're a first responder, or unless you had been traumatized at work and you had work cover pay for it, there was no way for a woman to access PTSD care if her trauma had been at the hands of her partner. So back then, when we had the mental health plan, we had 10 sessions a year. But we have to remember that back then, she rarely had anybody identify her trauma, let alone refer her to the appropriate services. Although some women could access a psychologist through victim service. It wasn't just that. Psychologists and psychiatrists who were meant to be treating the PTSD, a lot of us had no training in providing trauma-specific care, let alone trauma-informed care. In fact, the vast majority of traumatized women would never talk to their health providers about their trauma. They would simply be labelled and treated for their symptoms. So if a traumatized woman was depressed, she would have a depressive disorder and be given antidepressants. If she was anxious, she would have an anxiety disorder and be given anti-anxiety medications. If she wanted to hurt herself, she would have a personality disorder. And if she went to hospital, they would tell her that the hospital couldn't help her. In 2021, her symptoms were her illness. Her symptoms defined her, and her symptoms could make her a bad mother. But that was the bad old days. Now, what we treat is the trauma itself. Women are traumatized by violence are finally recognized as having experienced an injury, and that injury can be used as evidence rather than used against her. We now offer a range of treatments, recognizing that not all women need the same thing. GPs are supported to give long consultations and they are confidential in nature. Those that offer this therapy must be trauma-informed and must have specific training. There are gender-specific inpatient units so that the admission itself is not traumatic. And there are specialised centres like the Trauma Recovery Centre, which provide yoga, meditation, neurofeedback, EMDR and psychotherapy. But it also provides access to other professionals that are specifically trained in recognising trauma. Specialists like myself will work in collaboration with child protection and legal services to promote the children being centred and children being actively supported to live with their protective parent. Children are seen as people in their own right, who are believed when they express fear, and who have a right to safety which trumps the right of an abuser to see them. They are now given psychological and educational support throughout their childhood to reduce the impact of intergenerational trauma. Professor Johnson, you were very inspiring when you talked about the ways that we can all make a difference, and I don't have anything more to add to that, but I will now introduce Minister for Gender Equity, Lula Dembele.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And thanks to everyone for having me here this evening. I want to thank Aunty Rhonda for your lovely welcome. I'd like to offer my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands, waterways and skies we meet on and benefit from every day, and acknowledge elders past and present. Australia should hold as sacred and revered that Aboriginal Australians are the oldest continuous culture on the earth. This land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'm joining you today from Wurundjeri country. I'd also like to acknowledge the many women and survivor advocates who have come before us, shared their stories, spoke up when nobody listened, challenged systems to acknowledge their suffering. We are here today building on their legacy, and we wouldn't have the space or have come so far without their hard work and sacrifices. I'm so proud to be the Minister for Gender Equity in Prime Minister Bernie's cabinet. Her exemplary leadership in elevating a dedicated focus on addressing intersectional barriers to achieving equality for all people has really allowed us to create the systemic change needed to start seeing outcomes moving in the right direction to reduce violence against women and their children. I'd like to highlight some of the positive trends we're seeing now and then reflect on what I observed was a key lever of change that happened back in 2021 and has helped us achieve those gains over the past 10 years. First of all, what are we seeing now that tells us we are on the right track for reducing family, domestic and sexual violence? Victim reporting rates have increased to be closer to what we know are the prevalency rates for violence against women. This may not be an obvious one, but I think it is important for demonstrating a cultural change towards women feeling a greater sense of being heard, believed and valued in society. We can see women's access to resources such as stable housing increasing. There has been an overall increase for women in secure work. Critically, conditions have improved for migrant and refugee women. The rate of men taking parental leave when a baby is born and using long-term flexible work arrangements for caring responsibility has increased by 30%. And women's leave from work due to domestic violence seems to be on a downward trend. After some dark days of decline in the early 2000s, Australia is finally making its way back up the ladder on the Global Gender Report from our shameful position of 50 in 2021 to 29 in 2031. We have decreased the amount of victim survivors who report experiencing re-traumatisation or victim blaming when engaged with policing, justice, child protection and family law systems. Our policy settings in these areas now recognise the threat environment women operate in due to the pervasive nature of men's violence against women. We've reviewed policies to stop punishing women for having limited agency in controlling relationships and being traumatised by abuse, including practices that perpetuate myths about women as liars or unstable or make women responsible for men's abuse against them. For example, freeze is recognised as the most common fight or flight response to sexual abuse or violence, and failure to actively fight back or show resistance is no longer allowed to be used by a defendant as a reason they believe someone was consenting to sexual activity. Neither, for that matter, is any questioning of what a woman was wearing beyond to establish the facts for an evidence brief. It is fully recognised now that a man or any person is responsible for their own sexual arousal and that being sexually aroused is not entitlement to use or violate another person's body for personal pleasure against their will. Children are no longer removed from their mothers who were previously seen as failing to protect children from a perpetrator's abuse. Now that systems are focusing on perpetrator accountability for their behaviour, the threat they pose to partners and children, and work is done with perpetrators and families directly to ensure both the protective parent and children are kept together and safe. And I want to acknowledge the Safe and Together Institute for their pioneering work in this area in Australia. Slowly but surely, we are working towards eradicating the idea that women who believe and report their child's disclosure of abuse do this to gain advantage in federal court or in separations, with judges and barristers who have demonstrated support for such narratives or use these arguments in court being removed from being able to practice in family law. We've also changed how we engage men who are coming into contact with police and justice systems in recognition that 80% of these men who are incarcerated have a history of complex trauma. We are now addressing men's recovery from trauma as a critical element of prevention of crime, rather than locking people up because they experience disadvantage and trauma. This is proving to be a critical pillar of stopping intergenerational perpetration of domestic and family violence. And critically, we have halved the rate of women being killed by a current or ex-male partner. Looking back at 2021, the fundamental shift that occurred was the second National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and their children funded the first national prevalence study on the perpetration of violence in intimate, domestic and family settings. The Perpetration Project ended up changing the way we as a nation view the problem of violence against women. For the first time, we brought an accountability focus to what we were working to reduce: behaviours of abuse and violence. From the data set of this study, we finally began to understand at a systemic level that while violence is a problem for victims, it is not a victim's problem. It is a perpetrator's problem. We realised that if we want to stop women being victimised and experiencing trauma, with all the negative impacts on health and women's ability to participate in the workforce, flow-on effects for health and justice systems and the economy, we actually have to target the people who are using abuse and violence. The Perpetration Project was a critical shift in national efforts from a reactive approach that relied on reports of abuse and violence before responding to a proactive mode focused on targeting prevention and early intervention against abusive behaviours. It did this in a few key ways. First, it filled a knowledge gap. Back in 2021, data perpetuated the narrative that domestic and family violence was a women's issue because they were the ones disproportionately victimised. You might remember the stats like 1 in 6 women experience partner violence and 1 in 2 women experience sexual harassment. Well, the Perpetration Project was the first to quantify how many men, women and non-binary people were using violence against their partners. But back in 2021, Australia simply did not have the data on. For the first time, we could quantify that 1 in 4 men used controlling and coercive behaviours towards their female partners, and even higher with 1 in 2 men whose female partner has English as a second language were using controlling and coercive behaviours against them. 1 in 5 men continued sexual activity with a woman when they knew she wasn't consenting. 1 in 10 women verbally attacked a male partner's sense of self based on his performance of masculine gender stereotypes. And 1 in 16 men had used the threat of suicide as a tactic in a cycle of abuse against an intimate partner, both male and female partners. The simple facts of knowing how prevalent men's use of abuse, of domestic, family and sexual violence meant that women are better believed now. The evidence backs up that statistically, women who experience abuse and violence by a man are most likely telling the truth. The results of data gathered through the Perpetration Project improved targeting of characteristics that heighten the likelihood of perpetration. By capturing details on who and why people perpetrate family, domestic and sexual violence, the Perpetration Project mapped the personal, social and structural motivators and drivers of violence at an individual and group level, building on the work that the Change the Story had done on identifying the gender drivers of violence. For example, the data revealed that non-Indigenous men will deliberately target Indigenous women, exploiting their relative position of power over them because existing discrimination against Aboriginal people means Indigenous women are less likely to be treated with empathy or more likely to be wrongly identified as a primary aggressor by police. Another significant impact the Perpetration Project had was that it supported victims' recovery by lessening stigma and shame experienced by victims. By creating a data set that focused on accountability for family, domestic and sexual violence on the perpetrators of violence, the public narrative and perception of who is responsible and who needs to take action changed. We then systematically sought to remove the ways infrastructure and services inherently asked the least empowered people in abusive situations to bear the responsibility for taking action. A focus on perpetration reduced the subtle communal victim blaming, such as the question, why didn't she leave? And instead focused attention on the question, how do we stop people abusing their partners? Reducing barriers to seeking help, such as victim blaming and social judgment, lessened the amount of victims staying trapped in abusive relationships and unable to recover from trauma. We're just about to start the third iteration of the perpetration project study under the National Action Plan. And since we actually have the baseline benchmark on the prevalence of perpetration rather than victimisation, we have been able to measure progress of reducing domestic and family and sexual violence at a national level. I certainly hope and expect, under the leadership of Prime Minister Bernie, that we'll continue this positive trend that I have outlined above. I want to thank you all so much for listening to me tonight and your time, and pass on to my esteemed colleague. It's been my privilege to work side by side on so many key initiatives with her over the past decade, the indomitable, can never say that word, Sally Stevenson. Thank you.
Very kind, thank you, Lula. It's been a pleasure working with all of you, and I think one of the things that is coming through on our speeches is the shared vision of what we're speaking about. But before I start, my thanks also to Aunty Rhonda for her warm and generous welcome to country and her insights into healing from violence and abuse. I'm on Dharug country, and this land is unceded. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I've been an advisor to the Australian Network of Women's Trauma Recovery Centres for the last 5 years. And before that, I was the General Manager of the Illawarra Women's Health Centre. But today, just shy of my 65th birthday, I'm retiring, and this is my retirement speech. I actually never thought I would see this day, not because of my age, but because I didn't think I could afford to retire. A single mum working in the community sector, but how far we have come. 10 years ago, in 2021, I remember how grim the world felt. Climate change, COVID, and underlying this, but being amplified by it, the public health epidemic of domestic, family and sexual violence. Working in that sector, you're always fighting for something, for recognition of the problem, for resources, for legislation that reflected women's experiences and actually protected them, for women against the criminal justice system or the family law system, or even working with women to overcome self-doubt, lack of self-esteem and self-loathing. And even fighting for the right to fight and not to be good victims, compliant and grateful and quiet. Wins were few and far between, and especially because we were dealing and trying to change such deep cultural and systemic issues. And I often imagine that we're on a ship heading into ever darkening waters, into the perfect storm, as it were, of violence, pandemic, climate catastrophe, the deepest burden of which is always shouldered by women. But things have changed, they really have. Firstly, I can retire, because as it happens, with a persistent, relentless and collective voice, we became, against the odds, a more humane society. And one of the indicators of this was that the community sector is now getting wages that reflect our value. Not quite in parity to investment banking, but there's been a balancing of sorts. And for the last 5 years, every dollar being put into superannuation in the community sector, the government is matching. And for those that don't have superannuation, the pension is now a livable income, funded, of course, by the removal of franking credits. As often happens when you're on the front line, it's hard to see the big picture perspective, to know at what point things turned. But looking back now, I can tell you the first sign of change, of hope. And that was in late 2021, when the McGovern family was allowed to go back to Bidjigal. And then in early 2022, Nauru and Manus were closed as detention sites, and those people seeking asylum lived in our community while their claims were assessed. And with this, there was an almost imperceptible change in how we viewed ourselves and who we wanted to be as a country. And in 2034, in a sure sign that the wave of change was not receding this time, Linda Burney was elected PM. Linda's quiet and steady wisdom, her experience and her culture both drove change and made people confident in it. Against a capitalist colonial system that has at its core the subjugation of women and the exploitation and humiliation of people of colour, she was revolutionary. She brought in universal childcare, invested in social housing, matching the New South Wales 1 in 5 strategy across Australia. She brought in a living wage for all people, national legislation that raised the age of incarceration from 10 to 18 years old, and new laws that required every organisation reporting either to the ATO or to the ACNC to demonstrate how they were anti-racist. And with this leadership, building on the voices of women who would not give up, and emboldened too by our Governor-General, Amani Haider, whose groundbreaking book of 2021, The Mother Wound, argued we were rightfully angry and should rightfully express that anger about abuse and violence. We started to shift. We started to see it shift the seemingly intractable attitudes to women and attitudes to men's violence. And can you believe it? We used to call it violence against women. But there were so many parts of this puzzle that finally came together. As Ash spoke, it was the healing ways of First Nations people brought to bear on country and on people. And as Lula spoke about, the shift from violence and abuse being a women's issue to being that of a men's violence problem, where perpetrators are removed and women and children are safe in their homes. And the part of the puzzle that I was involved with was the Women's Trauma Recovery Centres. Funnily enough, as I was clearing out my desk today, I came across the business case, submitted as it would happen exactly 10 years ago yesterday. First established in the Illawarra, it was community-led, community-based, and a dedicated, specialised, wraparound, one-stop shop that supported women to recover from the trauma of violence and abuse. It was based on the healing framework of First Nations people. And it was a centre that was trauma and violence informed. It did not judge women, but authentically listened to them and truly believed them, and supported them across all aspects of recovery: medical, mental health, legal, parenting, for as long as it took. And it supported them also through the systems that they needed to navigate, negotiate, and fight against, thereby preventing re-traumatisation. And as people came to see and experience the profound impact of this centre on women and their ability to recover, so word of mouth spread across the land, and there was a groundswell of demand for communities to establish their own centres. It was amazing. There wasn't just a demand, there was an expectation that as they had access to fracture clinics and breast clinics and cancer clinics, so they should have access to trauma recovery centres. And the government responded, not just because it was the compassionate thing to do, but as the original business case argued, it was a strategic and cost-effective intervention. In 2021 dollars, it would cost the centre $25,000 per woman recovered over a period of 3 years. Right now, in those dollars, and then it costs the New South Wales state $31,000 every 3 years to do nothing. And this would increase and accumulate over time if no treatment was given. It was a financial non-brainer. And now there are 20 centres across Australia, 20 centres that support women to stay in their homes and not be compelled to remain in abusive relationships because of financial dependence or coercive control. So whereas in 2021, there was an estimated 7,000 women who had to return to violent relationships because there was no housing, that's now down to 1,000. 20 centres that support women to supported women to support their children and to keep them out of a violent environment and experiencing abuse themselves, where women don't have their children removed because they can't protect against the perpetrator. So whereas in 2021, there were 15,000 children per year at risk of serious harm due to domestic and family violence, now it's less than 2,000. 20 centres that never once victim blame or perpetuate stigma by labelling women with borderline personality disorders because she's having a very normal response to an extreme, high threat and usually long-term experience. Centres that say, what happened to you rather than what is wrong with you. So in 2031, there are 20 centres, and according to projections, there's going to be another 10 more by 1041, but then they start to decrease because we see violence and abuse intergenerationally dropping. And over time, we won't be needing those centres anymore. And I feel such optimism as I leave, because the next generation of young women, the Gen Zs and the Generation COVIDs, who we hear so much about being entitled and spoiled, but what people didn't see then, but what we've seen now, is that yes, young women did behave as if they're entitled. They're entitled to speak their truth. They're entitled to live a life free of fear and violence, free of fear of violence and abuse. And speak they did. They built a wave of power from the community that's now unstoppable. So there were so many actions coalescing with the power of women's voices, and here we are. We're still on that boat, but our course has shifted. It's shifted towards a different horizon. Yeah, one where there are clouds, of course, for sure, but it's a horizon that is welcoming, where women are celebrated and not abused, where the resistance of women to violence over generations and the voice of our younger generation of women and men, girls and boys, join together and to continue to bring us to calmer waters. By the way, too, I just heard today that Thanika in Biloela has been selected to be in the under-15 Queensland Country Girls hockey team. She's now running free and fierce on that field, and she's winning, as we all are. So thank you. I'm off to be a grey nomad, and first, because COVID's over, is to the Pink Mosque in Iran, and then who knows. Thank you. So that's the end of our speakers, and I just wanted to thank, well, I'm meant to be thanking the presenters, and I do, and I thanked Rhonda, but I'd also like to thank Dr. Clare Cooper and Arun Jagan for their superb organisation for this webinar. It's been a wonderful process for all of us, I think, and a creative process that has, it's hard actually to put yourself in 2031 and to look back. It's a real mind shift, and it's been really exciting. And as I said just before I started to speak, it's wonderful to see that even though we were working together, we came to with these visions independently, and they coalesced, and that gives us hope for the future. I'd also like to thank all the organisations behind this. Of course, Illawarra Women's Health Centre, where we're from, the University of Sydney, where Claire is from, the Accountability Project Matter, the Project of Accountability Matters from Lula, the Royal College of Australia New Zealand, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, where Karen is from, and Women Illawarra, where Ash is from. Thank you all. So the next part of this session is that we're going into the workshops, and I really want to thank everybody who applied to the workshops. We were massively oversubscribed, and we could only select 30 people. So for those who weren't selected, we will be reaching out to you for further advocacy options and initiatives. So if you've enjoyed tonight, if you're inspired, or you've got some ideas about how we can get to 2031 and see that vision realised, please tweet your thoughts and opinions on hashtag FDSV2031. And for those who are in the workshops, oh sorry, excuse me, I didn't thank Médecins Sans Frontières, which is a big mistake because I'm part of it as well. Sorry about that. So those who are in the advocacy workshops, please click on the Zoom link that you were sent in your email. And to everybody else, we really thank you for coming tonight and listening, and we hope to engage with you into the future. Take care.
Thanks so much, Sally, and thank you again, everyone, for coming. We'll end this session now. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.